There are forms of existence that make death seem like mercy, and I have endured them all. My name was Sylvanus Windrunner, and I held the title of Ranger General of Silvermoon when I still believed in such things as honor, duty, and the warmth of a beating heart. I have walked paths that blur the line between salvation and damnation, have made choices that haunt the spaces between breath and silence. In this place of eternal shadow, where time moves like honey through broken glass, I remember what it meant to be alive. Let me tell you how the living become the damned, how love transforms into loss, and how even the dead can learn the true meaning of suffering. I remember sunlight, not the pale imitation that filters through the perpetual gloom of this realm, but true sunlight that kissed skin with warmth and painted the world in shades of gold and amber. I remember how it felt to breathe, to fill lungs with air that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, to feel my heart beat its steady rhythm against my ribs like a drum keeping time with the very pulse of life itself. These are the memories that torment me most deeply, for they remind me of what I have lost, what was stolen from me, what I chose to abandon in pursuit of purposes I once believed noble. In those distant days when I wore flesh instead of shadow, when blood ran warm through veins instead of this cold void that now sustains me, I was more than title and duty. I was a sister, a daughter, a guardian of something precious and irreplaceable. The halls of Silvermoon rang with laughter then, with the voices of my siblings raised in song and jest, with the comfortable silences that exist only between those who know each other's hearts as well as their own. Alaria, my elder sister, carried herself with the confidence of one born to lead, yet she bore that burden with grace that made it seem effortless. I watched her move through the courts of Silvermoon like sunlight through crystal, illuminating everything she touched with purpose and certainty. She spoke of distant lands and grand adventures, of duties that called her beyond the borders of our perfect realm. Even then, I think I knew she would leave us, drawn by horizons that our homeland could never contain. The Alliance needed heroes, and Alaria answered that call as surely as rivers flow toward the sea. Verisa, younger than I by only a handful of years, possessed a diplomat's tongue and a peacemaker's heart. Where Alaria and I might clash over matters of strategy or principle, Verisa would find the words that built bridges between our stubborn positions. She had inherited our mother's gift for seeing hope in the darkest circumstances, for finding the thread of light that could guide lost souls back to safety. I envied that quality in her sometimes, that ability to believe in the fundamental goodness of the world, even when evidence suggested otherwise. But it was Lirith who held the deepest place in my heart, my little brother who chose melody over the harsh songs of warfare. While the rest of our family trained with blade and bow, Lirith pursued the gentler arts, coaxing beauty from instruments with the same dedication that I brought to the hunt. His music had the power to heal wounds that steel could only deepen, to speak truths that mere words could never convey. I had made it my mission to keep him safe, to ensure that his hands would never know the weight of weapons, never be stained with the necessities of battle. How foolish I was to think that love could serve as armor against fate. How naive to believe that duty and devotion could protect those we cherish from the cruel mathematics of war. I told myself that by bearing the burden of violence, by accepting the responsibilities that came with command, I was creating a space where Lirith could remain untouched by darkness. I was wrong about so many things. The weight of leadership settled upon my shoulders like a mantle woven from duty and expectation. As Ranger General of Silvermoon, I commanded the loyalty of thousands, held the lives of my people in hands that trembled sometimes with the magnitude of that responsibility. Each decision rippled outward like stones cast into still water, affecting families, futures, the very survival of our ancient realm. I walked the borders of our lands with a vigilance that bordered on obsession, studying every tree, every path, every shadow that might conceal an enemy's approach. Our forests whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen, and I had spent decades learning their language. I could read the story of the wind in the bend of branches, could track the passage of creatures through signs so subtle that others would dismiss them as random chance. These skills served me well in the endless game of protection and patrol, but they also bound me to the land in ways that went deeper than mere familiarity. I was part of Quel'Thalas, as surely as the ancient trees were part of its soil, and the thought of anything threatening that harmony filled me with a cold fury that could freeze rivers. The relationship I shared with Nathanos Maris existed in defiance of convention and expectation. He was human, I was elven. He was an outsider seeking acceptance in a realm that had little patience for his kind, while I was bound by blood and duty to that same realm's preservation. Yet something in his steady gaze and unwavering dedication spoke to depths in my soul that I had not known existed. He saw past the title, past the responsibility, past the careful mask of command I wore like armor. In his presence, I could remember what it felt like to be simply Sylvanas, not the Ranger General, not the protector of thousands, just a woman capable of love and doubt and fierce joy. Our stolen moments together carried the weight of rebellion and the sweetness of secrets shared. We would meet in clearings where starlight filtered through leaves like scattered diamonds, would speak of dreams that had nothing to do with duty or the grim necessities of defense. He made me laugh in ways I had almost forgotten were possible, made me believe that perhaps there was room in my life for something beyond the endless vigilance that my position demanded. I knew that others whispered about us, that some questioned the wisdom of allowing a human into the inner circles of elven society, but their disapproval seemed small and petty compared to the warmth I found in his arms. But even in those moments of stolen happiness, shadows gathered at the edges of my awareness. Reports filtered in from the human kingdoms, stories too strange and terrible to be believed, yet too persistent to be dismissed. Entire villages had fallen silent overnight, their populations vanishing as if swallowed by the earth itself. Those few survivors who managed to flee spoke of corpses that walked, of a plague that transformed the living into shambling horrors that served an intelligence too alien to comprehend. I listened to these accounts with growing unease, my hunter's instincts screaming warnings that my rational mind struggled to accept. The humans had always been prone to exaggeration, to transforming natural disasters into supernatural terrors through the alchemy of fear and superstition. Yet these stories came from too many sources, carried too much specific detail to be mere fabrications born of panic. Something was moving in the world beyond our borders, something that threatened the careful balance we had spent centuries maintaining. King Anasterion dismissed these concerns with the casual confidence of one who had lived through countless human conflicts and emerged unscathed. Our magical defenses had withstood the tests of ages, had turned back invasions that would have shattered lesser realms. The Sunwell itself stood as both symbol and source of our power, a beacon of energy that no force in existence could hope to overcome. We were safe behind barriers wrought of starlight and ancient wisdom, protected by magics that predated the rise of human civilization itself. I wanted to share his certainty, to find comfort in the strength of our traditional defenses. But instinct whispered warnings that pride and precedent could not silence. I increased patrols along our borders, sent scouts deeper into the contested lands to gather intelligence on whatever force was spreading chaos among the human settlements. The reports they brought back spoke of an enemy unlike any we had faced before, an army that grew stronger with each defeat it inflicted upon its foes. The last day of my mortal life dawned clear and bright, painted in the soft pastels of early autumn that reminded me why I loved this land with every fiber of my being. I walked through gardens where flowers bloomed in defiance of the changing season, their beauty made more precious by its fragility. I shared breakfast with my family in chambers that echoed with comfortable conversation and familiar laughter. Verisa spoke of diplomatic missions to the human courts, while Lerath played melodies that seemed to capture the very essence of morning light transformed into sound. I remember thinking that whatever darkness threatened the world beyond our borders, it would break against the strength of our unity, like waves against an unshakable shore. I had my family, my duty, my love, and the unshakable conviction that these things would endure whatever storms might come. I was certain that the bonds we shared were stronger than any force that sought to tear them apart, that love and determination could overcome even the most terrible adversities. How could I have known that certainty itself would become my enemy? How could I have imagined that the very strength of my convictions would blind me to truths too horrible to accept? In a few short hours, everything I believed about the world, about good and evil, about the power of love to protect what mattered most, would crumble like walls built of sand against the tide. I held Lerath close that morning, breathing in the scent of his hair and committing to memory the sound of his heartbeat against my chest. I kissed Nathanos beneath trees that had witnessed 1,000 such partings and reunions, promising him that I would return before the sunset on another day. I stood with my parents in chambers where generations of windrunners had planned defenses and celebrated victories, accepting their blessing and carrying their love with me like armor against whatever waited in the gathering darkness. These memories burn in my consciousness now, like stars glimpsed through storm clouds, beautiful and distant and forever beyond my reach. They remind me of what it meant to hope, to trust, to believe in tomorrow with the innocent faith of those who have never stared into the face of absolute evil. In this place where time moves like poison through veins, where every moment stretches into eternity, these fragments of warmth and light serve as both blessing and curse, proof that I was once capable of joy, and evidence of how far I have fallen from grace. The morning that death came to Quel'Thalas arrived disguised as any other, wearing the familiar mask of routine and predictability that had lulled us into a sense of eternal security. I remember standing on the ramparts of Silvermoon, watching the sun paint our forests in shades of gold and amber, believing with the unshakable certainty of youth that this beauty would endure forever. The air carried the scent of pine and morning dew, the same perfume that had greeted my ancestors for thousands of years. How could I have known that I was breathing free air for the last time, that the next breath would taste of ash and corruption? The first reports reached me like whispers, carried on a wind that should not have been blowing. Fragments of intelligence so impossible that my mind rejected them even as my instincts screamed their truth. A massive army approached our borders, but it was not the chaotic rabble of orc raiders or the desperate migrations we had witnessed in generations past. This force moved with purpose and intelligence, guided by a will that understood strategy and possessed resources beyond anything we had imagined possible. More disturbing still were the descriptions of its composition, accounts that spoke of warriors who felt no fear because they no longer drew breath, of siege engines pulled by creatures that had once been horses, but now moved with the mechanical precision of clockwork automatons. I dispatched my fastest scouts to gather more detailed intelligence, to bring back information that would allow me to plan a proper defense against whatever threatened our realm. They returned pale and shaken, their eyes carrying the hollow stare of those who have witnessed horrors that language cannot adequately describe. The enemy army was vast beyond counting, they reported, stretching across the landscape like a living carpet of death and decay. At its head rode a figure in black armor, mounted upon a pale horse that left frost in its wake despite the warmth of the season. This was no mere general or warlord, but something that radiated cold and malice with the intensity of a negative star, drawing heat and hope from everything within its presence. When I pressed them for more specific details about numbers and tactics, about the composition of enemy forces and their apparent objectives, my scouts could only shake their heads in defeat. "How do you count an army that grows with every victory it achieves?" they asked me. "That transforms fallen defenders into new recruits for its endless march? How do you plan against an enemy that feels no fatigue, requires no supply lines, acknowledges no distinction between victory and massacre?" These were questions for which my training had provided no answers, scenarios that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional warfare. The first assault came at dawn 3 days later, preceded by a darkness that had nothing to do with the natural progression of night into day. The sky itself seemed to recoil from what approached our borders, clouds fleeing before a presence that turned morning light grey and sickly. I stood with my rangers along our first defensive line, arrows nocked and ready, hearts beating with the anticipation that always precedes battle. We had faced enemies before, had defended our homeland against threats both subtle and direct. This would be different only in scale and intensity, or so I told myself in the final moments before innocence died forever. The sight that emerged from the diseased morning mist challenged every assumption I had ever made about the nature of war, about the boundaries that separated the possible from the impossible. The enemy force that approached our positions moved with the terrible synchronicity of a machine built for destruction. Thousands upon thousands of figures that had once been human, but now served purposes antithetical to everything life represented. They advanced without battle cries or banners, without the chaotic energy that characterized living armies, their silence more terrifying than any war chant could have been. At their head rode the figure my scouts had described, and seeing him with my own eyes, I understood why their words had failed to capture the full extent of the horror he represented. Prince Arthas Menethil, once a paladin of the light, once a hero whose name had been spoken with reverence and hope, now sat astride his pale mount like a mockery of everything noble and pure. The blade he carried pulsed with malevolent energy, hungering for souls with an appetite that seemed to distort the very air around it. When he raised that cursed weapon toward our defenses, I felt something fundamental shift in the world, as if reality itself had been wounded by its presence. The battle that followed defied every principle of warfare I had spent decades mastering. Our arrows found their targets with deadly precision, piercing hearts and shattering skulls with impacts that should have dropped any living foe. Instead, the undead warriors continued their advance, unimpeded by wounds that would have been instantly fatal to creatures that still possessed functioning circulatory systems. Worse still, those few enemies that our concentrated fire managed to destroy completely were soon replaced by new horrors, our own fallen comrades rising to join the ranks of those who had cut them down. I watched in growing despair as the mathematics of attrition worked inexorably against us. Every casualty we inflicted was temporary, while every loss we sustained strengthened our enemy's position. The tactical situation deteriorated with each passing hour, forcing me to make the kind of decisions that no commander should ever face. How do you choose which section of your line to sacrifice when abandoning any position means condemning loyal soldiers to fates worse than death? How do you maintain morale when victory becomes impossible and survival questionable? The order to fall back to our second defensive position tasted like poison on my tongue, bitter with the knowledge of what it meant for those we left behind. I had never given ground before, had never been forced to acknowledge that duty might require retreat in the face of overwhelming force. The words themselves felt like betrayal as I spoke them, a violation of every oath I had sworn to protect our people and our land. but duty sometimes demands that we swallow our pride and accept the unacceptable, that we sacrifice our principles on the altar of practical necessity. Our second line held for barely 6 hours before the same inexorable logic forced another withdrawal. The enemy adapted to our tactics with frightening intelligence, countering every defensive strategy we employed with innovations that suggested not just experience, but understanding of our capabilities and limitations. This was no mindless horde driven by hunger and instinct, but an army guided by a will that possessed both patience and cunning in equal measure. Arthas himself moved through the battle like a conductor directing a symphony of destruction, orchestrating death with the precision of one who had studied war's darkest arts. As our positions collapsed one by one, I began to understand that we were not simply losing a battle, but witnessing the methodical dismantling of everything our civilization had built over millennia. The enemy was not content with mere conquest. It sought to corrupt and transform, to remake our realm in its own image of death and decay. Every shrine it captured became a source of necrotic energy. Every sacred grove transformed into a breeding ground for abominations that defied natural law. This was not war but violation, not conquest but desecration of the most fundamental kind. The final retreat brought us to the gates of Silvermoon itself, to walls that had stood unconquered for thousands of years, but now seemed fragile as paper before the advancing tide of corruption. I gathered my remaining forces in the shadow of spires that had witnessed countless victories, knowing with the terrible certainty that comes with experience that this would likely be their final hour. The faces around me showed the strain of impossible choices and witnessed horrors, but they also reflected the grim determination that had sustained our people through earlier dark ages. It was there, with my back against the walls of the city I had sworn to protect, that I made my final stand. The words I spoke were not battle cries, but something deeper, older, drawn from traditions that connected us to the very foundations of our identity. In the ancient tongue of my people, I sang the lament that had been passed down through generations of defenders, the song that transformed individual mortality into collective immortality. My voice rose above the sounds of battle, carrying with it the weight of history and the promise that some things endure even when the vessels that contain them are broken. The confrontation with Arthas came at the moment when hope finally died, when the last of my rangers fell, and I stood alone before the gates that would never open for me again. He approached with the casual arrogance of one who has never known true defeat, who sees opposition as mere entertainment rather than genuine obstacle. The corruption that surrounded him made the air itself recoil, turned breath into poison and light into shadow. Yet when he spoke, his voice retained traces of the nobility he had once possessed, making his fall all the more terrible to witness. "You are not welcome here," I told him, though we both knew the futility of such declarations. "I am Sylvanas Windrunner, Ranger General of Silvermoon. I advise you to turn back now." The words carried no weight against what he had become, but they needed to be spoken nonetheless, if only to maintain the fiction that resistance remained possible. He smiled at my defiance, an expression that belonged on the face of a young paladin, but had been twisted into something that mocked the very concept of mercy. "It is you who should turn back, Sylvanas," he replied, and hearing my name spoken in that voice was like listening to a beloved song performed by a choir of the damned. Death itself has come to your lands. I knew then, with the clarity that comes in moments of ultimate crisis, that he spoke simple truth. This was not Prince Arthas Menethil who stood before me, but something that wore his flesh like a costume, something that had devoured everything noble about him and left only hunger and malice in its place. The battle between us was brief and brutal, conducted with weapons and techniques that belonged to the realm of the living. My arrows found their mark with precision, born of desperation. Each shot aimed at vital points that should have ended any mortal conflict. But mortality had become irrelevant, and the wounds I inflicted closed almost as quickly as I could create them. His blade sang through the air with inhuman speed, driven by strength that no living muscle could have provided. When it found its mark, piercing the gap between my armor plates and sliding between ribs to find my heart, I felt something more than physical pain. The moment of my death arrived, wrapped in unexpected mercy, a gift I had not known I was capable of receiving. As consciousness began to fade and the urgent business of breathing became unnecessary, I felt a peace descend upon me that was deeper and more complete than any rest I had known in life. The pain of my wounds disappeared, replaced by a warmth that seemed to emanate from the very core of my being. I could sense the presence of those who had gone before me, could hear voices calling my name with love and welcome that promised an eternity free from struggle and sorrow. For one perfect moment, I understood that death was not ending, but transformation, not loss, but homecoming to a place where all burdens would be lifted and all questions answered. The light that beckoned me was brighter than the sunwell itself, yet gentle enough to soothe eyes that had seen too much darkness. I prepared to step forward into that radiance, to leave behind the weight of responsibility and the pain of failure, to find the rest that every warrior dreams of earning through service and sacrifice. But that peace, that perfect moment of release and reunion, was torn from me with violence that dwarfed any physical agony I had ever endured. I felt my soul, already free and soaring toward its eternal reward, seized by chains that burned with cold fire and dragged back toward the flesh it had rightfully abandoned. The process was violation in its purest form, rape of the spirit that left wounds no earthly medicine could heal. Where there had been warmth and welcome, now there was only ice and screaming emptiness. The consciousness that returned to my body was not the same one that had departed it. Something fundamental had been torn away in that violent resurrection. Something that connected me to warmth and hope and the capacity for simple human feeling. I found myself trapped in flesh that no longer felt like home, bound to existence by chains wrought of malice and cruelty. When I tried to speak, my voice emerged as something between a wail and a shriek, a sound that belonged to no creature meant to walk beneath clean sky. I was no longer Sylvanas Windrunner, Ranger General of Silvermoon. I had become something else, something that existed in the spaces between life and death without belonging to either realm. The body I inhabited was mine, yet not mine, responsive to my will, yet alien in ways that defied description. Most terrible of all was the understanding that this was not temporary suffering, but permanent exile from everything that had given my existence meaning and purpose. Arthur stood over my transformed form, and the satisfaction in his expression was more terrible than any weapon he could have wielded. "After all you have put me through, woman," he said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of one who had forgotten what mercy meant, "the last thing I will give you is the peace of death." The words fell upon my consciousness like hammer blows, each syllable driving home the magnitude of what had been stolen from me. I understood then that my torment had only begun, that death would have been kindness compared to what lay ahead. From my new vantage point as something neither living nor dead, I watched the systematic destruction of everything I had spent my mortal life defending. The city that had stood as a beacon of civilization for thousands of years burned with fires that consumed more than mere wood and stone. The flames that Arthas commanded devoured hope itself, transforming beauty into nightmare and sanctuary into charnel house. My people, the elves I had sworn to protect, fell before the advance of his corrupted army like wheat before a scythe that harvested souls instead of grain. I tried to cry out, to warn them or comfort them or simply bear witness to their suffering, but the sounds that emerged from my transformed throat brought only more agony to those who heard them. My voice had become a weapon turned against those I loved, a banshee's wail that shattered armor and stopped hearts with its otherworldly keening. I was forced to watch as my very attempts at mercy became instruments of destruction, as love transformed into the agency of death. This was the true genius of Arthas's revenge, the perfect cruelty that would haunt me through all the years that followed. He had not simply killed me, but had made me complicit in the destruction of everything that had given my life meaning. I was both victim and perpetrator, mourner and murderer, witness to atrocities that I was powerless to prevent yet somehow responsible for enabling. The chains that bound me to this existence were forged not just from malice, but from guilt that would never find absolution. In that moment, suspended between what I had been and what I was becoming, I finally understood the true nature of damnation. Hell was not a place of fire and brimstone, but a state of being in which love became poison, hope transformed into despair, and every noble impulse twisted into its own negation. I had entered a realm where the very act of caring became a source of infinite suffering, where memory served only to illuminate the magnitude of what had been lost forever. The slavery that followed my transformation was unlike any bondage that the living can comprehend, for it was imprisonment of the soul itself, a captivity that made mockery of every concept of freedom I had ever known. To be conscious yet powerless, to possess will yet lack agency, to understand right from wrong while being compelled to serve evil incarnate. This was a torment designed by minds that understood the deepest cruelties possible to inflict upon thinking beings. Every moment of that enslavement stretched like centuries, each second an eternity of awareness, trapped within flesh that no longer obeyed my commands. The voice that spoke through me was not my own, though it emerged from the throat that had once sung lullabies to my younger siblings and whispered words of love to Nathanos beneath starlit skies. This new voice carried the chill of northern winds and the hunger of things that dwelt in shadows between worlds, speaking words that my mind screamed against even as my lips formed them with perfect precision. I became a marionette dancing to melodies composed in hell, my every movement choreographed by a will that found amusement in the degradation of what I had once been. The first command came as we stood amid the smoking ruins of Silvermoon, the ashes of my homeland still warm beneath feet that could no longer feel heat or cold. Arthas gestured toward a group of survivors who had emerged from hiding places they believed might shelter them from the nightmare their world had become, and I felt my consciousness pulled aside like a curtain while something else assumed control of my actions. The Banshee wail that erupted from my transformed throat was not sound, but devastation given voice, a keening that shattered stone and stopped hearts with its otherworldly resonance. I watched from behind my own eyes as those I had spent my life protecting fell before the weapon my voice had become, their faces twisted in agony that mirrored my own internal anguish. These were people I knew, elves whose names I could recite, whose families had served alongside mine for generations uncounted. Children who should have grown to see 1,000 springs cowered before the horror I had become, their innocent eyes reflecting back my own damnation. Yet I could not stop the sounds that poured from my throat any more than I could close my eyes against witnessing their effects. The worst part was not the killing itself, though each death felt like a piece of my soul being torn away, but the understanding that some fragment of my consciousness participated in these atrocities. The Banshee that wielded my voice drew upon memories and emotions that belonged to Sylvanas Windrunner, corrupting love into hatred and protection into destruction. It was not simply that I was forced to watch evil being done, but that my own feelings and experiences were being perverted to fuel that evil, turned into weapons against everything I had once held sacred. Between these, moments of compelled action came periods of waiting that were almost worse than the commands themselves. Times when my consciousness was left alone with the memory of what I had been forced to do and the anticipation of horrors yet to come. I existed in a state of perpetual preparation for the next violation of my will, the next desecration of everything I had once been. Sleep offered no escape, for the undead require no rest, and dreams had become impossible luxuries reserved for those who still possessed souls capable of hope. Arthas took particular pleasure in ensuring I remained aware during these interludes, that I understood exactly what I had become and what purposes I was being made to serve. He would speak to me as if I were still the Ranger General he had defeated, addressing me with mock courtesy that made his casual cruelty all the more unbearable. He spoke of my former life as if it had been a children's game, a naive fantasy that reality had finally corrected through the application of sufficient force. "Your people trusted you to protect them," he would say, his voice carrying the amused condescension of one explaining simple concepts to a slow child. "And in a way, you are still serving that function. You are teaching them the truth about the world, showing them that hope is an illusion and resistance is futile. In their final moments, they understand what you have learned, that death is not ending but beginning, not defeat but transformation into something more honest about the nature of existence." These philosophical torments cut deeper than any physical pain could have reached, striking at the core of what had given my existence meaning and purpose. I had built my identity around the concepts of duty and protection, around the belief that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. To have those beliefs turned into instruments of destruction, to watch as love became the fuel for hatred and sacrifice, the foundation for cruelty, this was devastation of the spirit that no healing could ever fully address. The resurrection of Kel'Thuzad provided a grotesque education in the true purposes I was being made to serve, revealing the cosmic scope of the evil I had become part of. I was commanded to stand witness as the necromancer's remains were gathered from the ruins of his former stronghold, each bone and fragment of corrupted flesh speaking to the careful planning that had preceded our invasion. This had never been about conquest in any conventional sense, but about harvesting the power necessary to fuel transformations that defied every natural law. As the ritual proceeded, drawing energy from the Sunwell itself to fuel the resurrection of one who should have remained forever dead, I began to understand that my transformation had been merely the first movement in a symphony of destruction that would play across multiple worlds. The forces that commanded Arthas possessed patience measured in eons and resources that spanned dimensions, viewing individual lives and entire civilizations as components in calculations too vast for mortal minds to comprehend. I was not a fallen hero being punished for failure, but a tool being prepared for purposes I could not yet imagine. The moment when Kel'Thuzad's consciousness returned to its reconstructed form was like watching evil itself take physical shape, witnessing the birth of something that should never have been allowed to exist. The Lich that rose from that circle of power was not simply undead, but actively antithetical to life, a negation of everything natural and wholesome that walked in shapes designed to mock the living. When he turned his attention to me, I felt the weight of intelligence older than human civilization, studying my form and finding it satisfactory for purposes I dreaded to learn. "Welcome back to the world of the living, my lord," I heard myself say, the words emerging without my volition or consent, carrying inflections of respect and loyalty that belonged to someone else entirely. The voice that used my throat spoke with perfect sincerity, as if the speaker genuinely revered the abomination that had been birthed through violation of cosmic law. Part of me screamed against these words, while another part, some fragment that had been carved from my consciousness and shaped to serve darker purposes, meant every syllable. Through the months that followed, I learned to recognize the different qualities of my enslavement. the varying degrees of violation that characterize different types of commands. Sometimes the control was absolute, reducing me to a passenger in my own flesh, while some other intelligence piloted my actions with mechanical precision. Other times, I retained awareness of my surroundings while being compelled to act against my will, feeling my body move in response to directives that my mind rejected with every fiber of remaining humanity. The worst commands were those that required me to participate emotionally as well as physically, that demanded not just obedience but enthusiasm for acts that should have filled me with revulsion. I was made to feel satisfaction at the suffering of innocence, to experience joy at the corruption of sacred places, to find pleasure in the transformation of beauty into nightmare. These violations of my inner self were more terrible than any torture of the flesh, for they suggested that the boundaries between self and other were not as absolute as I had believed. During the brief moments when the Lich King's attention was focused elsewhere, when the chains that bound my will loosened enough to allow fragments of autonomous thought, I would attempt to reassert control over my consciousness and remember what it had felt like to make choices. These interludes were simultaneously blessing and curse, offering glimpses of freedom that made the return to slavery all the more unbearable. I would try to speak my own name, to recall the faces of those I had loved, to hold on to some core of identity that remained untainted by what I had been forced to become. But even these moments of apparent freedom were suspect, tainted by the possibility that they too were part of my torment, carefully orchestrated reminders of what I had lost rather than genuine opportunities for resistance. How could I trust any thought or feeling when I had experienced the violation of having foreign emotions imposed upon my consciousness? How could I distinguish between my own desires and those that had been planted there by minds that understood manipulation as both art and science? The philosophical implications of my condition haunted me with questions that had no satisfactory answers, puzzles that could drive a thinking being to madness through their very insolubility. If my actions were not chosen but compelled, was I responsible for the atrocities I committed? Did guilt require agency, or was it sufficient to possess awareness of right and wrong, regardless of one's ability to choose between them? When foreign thoughts and emotions were imposed upon my consciousness, which responses could I claim as authentically mine? These abstract considerations became intensely personal as I was forced to participate in increasingly horrific acts, each one raising new questions about the nature of culpability and the boundaries of the self. I watched myself lead groups of newly risen undead against populations that included elves I had once called friends, saw my own corrupted voice convince former comrades to surrender rather than fight against overwhelming odds. The tactical knowledge I possessed, the understanding of defensive strategies and hidden escape routes, all of this became weapons turned against those I had spent my life protecting. The corruption spread beyond my actions to contaminate memory itself, as experiences of love and loyalty were transformed into sources of pain and mockery. Thoughts of Lirith's music became accompaniment to scenes of slaughter, while memories of Nathanos' touch were perverted into celebration of victories won through betrayal and deceit. Nothing remained untouched by the malice that had claimed me, no corner of consciousness that could serve as refuge from the spreading infection of enforced evil. Yet perhaps most terrible of all was the gradual realization that some part of me was adapting to this existence, learning to function within the parameters of slavery rather than fighting constantly against the chains. The mind, that infinitely flexible instrument of survival, began to discover ways of protecting itself from the worst psychological damage by accepting what could not be changed and finding accommodation with horror. This adaptation felt like the final betrayal, the ultimate surrender of everything that had made me who I was. I felt myself growing colder, not in any physical sense, but in ways that affected the very core of my being. Emotions that had once burned bright began to dim, love transforming into something more like distant memory than living reality. The capacity for hope, for joy, for the simple pleasure of being alive. These qualities that had sustained me through the darkest periods of my mortal existence began to wither like flowers exposed to killing frost. The irony was not lost on me that in becoming undead, I was also dying in ways more fundamental than the mere cessation of biological function. The Sylvanas Windrunner, who had stood on the walls of Silvermoon, who had loved and laughed and believed in the possibility of protecting what mattered most, was slowly being murdered by degrees, replaced by something that wore her face but served purposes antithetical to everything she had valued. This was not resurrection, but substitution, not preservation, but perversion of identity itself. Time became meaningless in this state of eternal servitude, marked not by the passage of days and seasons, but by the accumulation of atrocities and the progressive erosion of whatever remained of my original self. I existed in a perpetual present tense of horror, unable to escape into past happiness or future hope, trapped in an endless now of violation and complicity. The Lich King's will pressed down upon me like the weight of frozen oceans, crushing any thought of resistance beneath the sheer impossibility of opposition. And through it all, I remained conscious, retained awareness of what was being done to me and what I was being made to do to others. This consciousness was not mercy, but its opposite, a guarantee that I would experience every moment of degradation with complete understanding of its significance. I was not allowed the refuge of madness or the escape of forgetfulness, but was forced to witness my own damnation with the clarity of one who had once believed in the possibility of redemption. Freedom, when it finally came, arrived not as liberation but as abandonment, not as victory, but as a terrible gift I had neither sought nor desired. The moment I felt the Lich King's control begin to waver, felt the chains that bound my consciousness start to loosen their grip, I experienced terror more profound than any I had known during my enslavement. For months beyond counting, I had existed without choice, without responsibility for my actions, sheltered from the weight of decision by the very captivity I had struggled against. Now, as that protection dissolved like morning mist, I found myself confronted with a freedom I no longer knew how to use. The first breath I drew as a truly autonomous being tasted of ash and betrayal, carrying flavors that belonged to no world meant for the living. I stood in the ruins of a village whose name I could not remember, surrounded by the corpses of people I had helped to murder, and felt the full weight of returning agency crash down upon my consciousness like a mountain falling from the sky. Every atrocity I had been forced to commit suddenly became mine to own. Every violation of everything I had once held sacred transformed from imposed suffering into personal responsibility. Choice, that gift I had treasured above all others during my mortal life, revealed itself to be a burden more terrible than any slavery could ever be. In captivity, I had been victim and witness, complicit perhaps, but not culpable in any meaningful sense. Now, faced with decisions that would ripple outward to affect others, I understood that freedom and guilt were forever intertwined, that the power to choose carried with it the obligation to accept consequences that might stretch across centuries. The other undead who had been freed alongside me wandered through the same ruins like lost children, their faces bearing expressions of confusion and dawning horror that mirrored my own internal landscape. We had been united in slavery, but were now isolated by the terrible democracy of individual choice, each forced to confront alone the question of what we should become now that we were no longer what we had been. Some collapsed beneath the weight of returning memory, unable to reconcile their actions during enslavement with any concept of the people they had once been. Others raged against the injustice of their condition, as if anger could somehow reverse the fundamental changes that had been wrought upon their very essence. I gathered these lost souls around me, not from any noble impulse toward leadership, but from the desperate need to find purpose in a world that seemed to have no place for creatures like us. We were neither living nor truly dead, existing in a liminal space between states of being that offered no comfort and precious little hope. Yet we were conscious, capable of thought and feeling, even if those thoughts and feelings had been forever altered by our shared experience of violation and transformation. If we could not reclaim what we had lost, perhaps we could create something new from the fragments of what remained. The name we chose for ourselves spoke to our fundamental condition with brutal honesty. We were the Forsaken, abandoned by the living world, rejected by death itself, left to forge our own path through a reality that had no rules for beings such as ourselves. The word carried weight beyond its simple meaning, encompassing not just our current state of abandonment, but our acceptance of that condition as something we would transform into strength rather than surrender to in despair. Vengeance became the cornerstone upon which I built this new identity, the single driving force that could give meaning to existence that might otherwise collapse beneath its own contradictions. Arthas had stolen more than life from us. He had taken hope, love, the very possibility of peace, and transformed us into living monuments to his cruelty. But in doing so, he had also created something he had not anticipated, beings possessed of both the will and the capability to oppose him, creatures who understood his methods because we had been forged by them, who knew his weaknesses because we had experienced them firsthand. This quest for vengeance was not the hot anger of the recently wronged, but something colder and more patient, refined by suffering into an instrument of terrible precision. I had learned to wait during my enslavement, to endure without breaking, to preserve some core of self despite violations that should have destroyed any coherent sense of identity. These hard-won skills now serve different purposes, allowing me to plan across decades rather than days, to build toward goals that might take lifetimes to achieve. The Undercity rose from the ruins of Lordaeron like a flower blooming in poisoned soil, beautiful in its own terrible way, yet fundamentally wrong in every detail. We carved our new home from the bones of the old capital, hollowing out crypts and catacombs that had once served as final resting places for the honored dead. The irony was not lost on any of us that we, who could not rest, were making our home among those who should have been resting eternally, that the peace denied to us surrounded us in the form of silent tombs. Creating this sanctuary required skills I had never developed during my mortal life, talents for organization and administration that had nothing to do with the martial prowess that had defined my previous existence. I learned to think like an architect instead of a general, to consider the needs of civilians rather than soldiers, to build something that could endure rather than something designed for glorious destruction. The irony that these peaceful arts were being employed to shelter creatures born from violence was another of the many contradictions that defined our existence. The undead who flocked to our banner came from every walk of life and death, united not by shared origins, but by common rejection from the world of the living. Former nobles worked alongside peasants. Priests labored next to criminals. All distinctions of rank and status dissolved by the democratic nature of undeath. We were equal in our abandonment, identical in our need for purpose and belonging, brothers and sisters in the strange fraternity of those who had been denied the mercy of final rest. Yet leadership of such beings required a different approach than commanding living soldiers. For the undead possessed neither the fears nor the hopes that motivate mortal behavior. They could not be threatened with death, for they had already experienced it, nor could they be promised rewards of flesh and comfort that no longer held meaning for them. Instead, I had to appeal to deeper needs, to the hunger for purpose that seemed to be the only desire that survived the transformation from life to undeath intact. The question that haunted our every gathering, every decision, every attempt at building something resembling civilization was simple in its phrasing, yet impossible in its implications. What are we if not monsters? The living world looked upon us and saw only abomination, corruption, the animated remnants of people who should have been allowed to rest in peace. They were not entirely wrong in this assessment, for we carried within ourselves the capacity for cruelties that living beings could barely imagine, powers that violated natural law simply by existing. Yet we retained enough of what we had been to recognize the monstrosity of what we had become, to feel horror at our own capabilities, even as we accepted the necessity of employing them. This self-awareness was perhaps the cruelest aspect of our condition, the feature that separated us from the mindless undead who served the scourge without question or regret. We knew what we were, understood the wrongness of our existence, yet were compelled to continue existing nonetheless. The living world's rejection of our attempts at peaceful coexistence forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of our condition and the limited options available to creatures such as ourselves. Emissaries sent to negotiate with human kingdoms returned with reports of revulsion and immediate hostility, stories of audiences that ended before they could properly begin, of offers of alliance dismissed without consideration. We were judged not by our intentions or our actions, but by the simple fact of what we had become, condemned without trial by beings who could not see past the violation of natural order that our existence represented. This rejection stung more deeply than any physical wound, for it confirmed suspicions that had been growing in the darker corners of our collective consciousness. Perhaps we truly were monsters, abominations that had no rightful place in any ordered universe. Perhaps the living were correct in their assessment that our continued existence was itself an affront to everything natural and good. Yet if we were monsters, we were thinking monsters, feeling monsters, monsters capable of choice and growth and perhaps even redemption, though that last possibility seemed increasingly remote with each passing season. The alliance with the Horde came about through necessity rather than genuine kinship, a political marriage between outcasts who shared little beyond their common rejection by more conventional societies. Thrall's offer of membership was motivated more by pragmatic considerations than any true acceptance of our nature, for the Orcs needed allies in their struggle against human expansion, while we required protection against the genocidal impulses of those who would see us all destroyed. It was an arrangement that satisfied immediate needs while addressing none of the deeper questions about our place in a world that seemed to have no room for beings such as ourselves. Even within the Horde, we remained outsiders, tolerated rather than embraced, useful rather than beloved. The Orcs and Trolls and Tauren who fought alongside us did so with visible discomfort, their natural instincts recoiling from proximity to creatures that embodied everything they had been taught to fear about death and corruption. They worked with us because necessity demanded it, but they did not trust us, could not trust us, for we represented possibilities too terrible for the living to contemplate with equanimity. This perpetual state of conditional acceptance shaped every decision I made as leader of the Forsaken, every policy I implemented in our strange underground kingdom. We could not afford to appear too threatening, lest we provoke the genocidal response that would end our experiment in autonomous undeath. Yet we could not appear too weak, lest we invite exploitation from those who saw us as disposable allies rather than equal partners. The balance required was delicate beyond description, demanding constant vigilance and careful calculation of every word and action. The Royal Apothecary Society emerged from this complex political situation as both shield and sword, an organization dedicated to advancing our interests through methods that the living world would find questionable at best. The creation of new plagues and toxins served multiple purposes simultaneously, providing weapons that could level the playing field against numerically superior living armies, while also pursuing research that might eventually lead to improvements in our condition. If we could not be accepted as we were, perhaps we could become something different, something that the world might find less objectionable. Yet each step down this path of pragmatic evil carried us further from any possibility of redemption or reconciliation with the world of the living. The experiments conducted in the deepest laboratories of our city would have horrified the woman I had once been. Violations of natural law and common decency that served purposes I told myself were necessary for our survival. Living subjects were transformed into undead through alchemical means that bypassed the necromantic energies traditionally required for such conversions, creating new forms of existence that were perhaps even more unnatural than our own. The ethical implications of these activities weighed heavily upon what remained of my conscience, yet I continued to authorize them because the alternatives seemed even more terrible. If we could not match the living world's capacity for reproduction and renewal, we would eventually dwindle away to nothing. Our brief experiment in autonomous undeath ending in the obscurity we had fought so hard to escape. If we could not defend ourselves against those who sought our destruction, we would face extinction at the hands of beings who would sleep peacefully after committing genocide against thinking, feeling creatures whose only crime was refusing to submit to final death. The reunion with Nathanos provided a bittersweet reminder of what love could become when filtered through the transformations that defined our existence. He had fallen to the scourge as so many others had, but unlike most, he had retained enough of himself to recognize me when freedom finally came to us both. The man I had loved still existed within the undead creature he had become, yet both of us had been changed in ways that made our former relationship impossible to simply resume as if nothing had happened. We had shared mortality once, had known the simple pleasure of warm skin against warm skin, had believed that our love could endure any trial that fate might devise. Now we existed as echoes of our former selves, capable of remembering what intimacy had felt like while being forever cut off from its full experience. The love remained, perhaps even strengthened by the trials we had endured, yet it had been transformed into something colder and stranger, a bond between creatures who no longer quite belonged to the same category of existence. This relationship became symbolic of everything the Forsaken represented: the persistence of human emotions and connections, despite transformations that should have destroyed them. The refusal to surrender hope, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that such hope was futile. We loved because we chose to love, not because love came naturally to creatures such as ourselves, and in that choice lay both our greatest strength and our most profound vulnerability. The consuming nature of my quest for vengeance began to shape not only my own decisions, but the entire direction of our nascent civilization, turning what might have been a society of refugees into something more closely resembling an army preparing for an eternal war. Every policy I implemented, every alliance I forged, every resource I allocated served the ultimate goal of preparing for the day when we would face Arthas and settle accounts for the suffering he had inflicted upon us. This singular focus provided unity and direction to a people who might otherwise have dissolved into chaos and despair, yet it also limited our potential for growth beyond the parameters of our shared trauma. The other Forsaken looked to me for leadership not because I possessed superior wisdom or greater virtue than they, but because my hatred burned with a purity and intensity that gave shape to their own confused impulses toward revenge. I became the embodiment of our collective rage, the living symbol of our refusal to accept what had been done to us as the final word on our existence. Yet this role required me to maintain that anger at a level that began to consume other aspects of my identity. to feed the flames of vengeance with pieces of myself, until little remained beyond the will to see our enemies destroyed. The passage of years brought changes to our underground kingdom that reflected both our growing sophistication as a society and our increasing distance from anything that could be called conventional morality. We developed art and literature that celebrated themes of death and transformation, created music that captured the melancholy beauty of existence without hope of final rest, established traditions that honored our condition rather than lamenting it. Yet we also became more ruthless in our methods, more willing to employ tactics that would have been unthinkable to the living people we had once been. This evolution was not consciously chosen, but emerged naturally from the pressures of our situation and the gradual erosion of moral constraints that had once seemed absolute. When faced with enemies who sought our complete annihilation, the luxury of ethical considerations became increasingly difficult to maintain. When surrounded by a world that rejected our very existence, the temptation to respond with equal hostility grew stronger with each passing season. We became what our circumstances demanded, yet in doing so, we also became something that the people we had once been would have found horrifying. The weight of leading creatures who had no natural place in any ordered universe pressed down upon me with increasing force as our society grew more complex and our ambitions expanded beyond simple survival. I made decisions that affected thousands of lives, choices that would ripple outward across decades or centuries, yet I did so from a position of fundamental uncertainty about what goals we should be pursuing or what ultimate fate might await us all. We were improvising our existence from moment to moment, creating meaning from chaos through sheer force of will. In quiet moments, when the demands of leadership temporarily ceased and I could retreat into the privacy of my own thoughts, I wondered whether we were building something worth preserving or merely delaying an inevitable reckoning with forces too powerful for us to ultimately overcome. The living world showed no signs of accepting our presence. Our undead condition grew no easier to bear with time, and our quest for vengeance seemed no closer to resolution despite all our preparations and planning. Perhaps we were simply postponing our own destruction, creating the illusion of progress while trapped in a situation that had no real solution. Yet even in these moments of doubt, I found myself unable to abandon the path I had chosen, or to counsel my people toward any form of surrender or acceptance of defeat. We existed because we chose to exist, maintained our society because we refused to allow it to collapse, pursued our goals because the alternative was an emptiness too terrible to contemplate. In that choice lay whatever dignity we possessed as creatures who had been denied every other form of grace or blessing that the universe might have offered. The Forsaken had become my life's work in every sense that mattered, the project into which I poured all the energy and passion that had once been directed toward protecting my homeland and my family. These undead refugees were my people now, their survival and prosperity the closest thing to purpose that my existence could claim. Whether we were building toward eventual redemption or simply creating a more elaborate form of damnation remained to be seen. But we would face whatever future awaited us as we had faced everything else. Together, conscious and utterly determined to make meaning from circumstances that should have destroyed any possibility of meaning at all. Victory, when it finally came, tasted of ashes and unfulfilled promises, carrying none of the satisfaction I had imagined during the long years of planning and preparation that had consumed my existence since gaining freedom from the Lich King's chains. I stood in the ruins of Icecrown Citadel, surrounded by the debris of Arthas's final defeat, and felt nothing where triumph should have blazed like a cleansing fire. The man who had destroyed everything I had once been lay dead at my feet, his cursed blade finally stilled, yet his destruction brought no peace to the wasteland that my heart had become. For decades, the dream of vengeance had sustained me through horrors that should have shattered any thinking mind, had provided purpose and direction to an existence that otherwise possessed neither meaning nor hope. Every decision I had made, every compromise with conscience I had accepted, every step down the path towards something darker than death itself had been justified by the promise of this moment. The belief that Arthas's end would somehow restore balance to a universe that had been wounded by his crimes. Now that promise revealed itself as nothing more than elaborate self-deception, a beautiful lie I had told myself to avoid confronting the true nature of what I had become. The hollow echo of my footsteps in the empty halls of the fallen citadel seemed to mock every assumption I had ever made about justice and redemption, about the possibility that suffering could be balanced through the application of appropriate punishment. Arthas was dead, his evil finally ended, his victims presumably avenged through the destruction of their tormentor. Yet I felt no lighter for his passing, no sense that the debts he had accumulated through his cruelties had been properly settled. Instead, I found myself confronting the uncomfortable truth that vengeance was not healing, but merely another form of damage, not restoration, but continuation of the cycles of harm that had shaped our shared history. The realization that my life's work had been completed yet had accomplished nothing of genuine importance struck me with force that made physical wounds seem like gentle caresses by comparison. If victory over my greatest enemy could not provide meaning to my existence, if the achievement of everything I had struggled toward left me emptier than before, what purpose could possibly justify continuing to draw breath in a world that had no place for creatures such as myself? The question echoed through chambers that had once housed absolute power, bouncing off walls that had witnessed the planning of atrocities beyond counting, receiving no answer but the sound of its own repetition. I climbed to the highest spire of the citadel, to the place where the frozen throne had once stood, as monument to the marriage of death and dominion, and looked out over landscapes scarred by conflicts whose origins stretched back beyond living memory. The view encompassed battlefields, where heroes had fallen and monsters had been born, where the fundamental laws governing life and death had been rewritten according to the whims of beings whose understanding of consequence remained forever incomplete. From this vantage point, the entire history of our world seemed nothing more than an endless sequence of tragedies interrupted by brief interludes of false hope. The wind that swept across those frozen wastes carried voices of the countless dead, whispers of those who had perished in conflicts they had never truly understood, ghosts of possibilities that had been murdered in their infancy by the cruel necessities of power and survival. I listened to those voices and heard in them an accusation that cut deeper than any blade forged in the mortal realm. That I had become indistinguishable from those I had once opposed, that my quest for justice had transformed me into yet another agent of the very forces I had sworn to resist. Standing at the edge of that precipice, gazing down into depths that promised oblivion as complete and final as any rest I had ever dreamed of achieving, I made a choice that felt like the first truly free decision I had exercised since my resurrection, as something neither living nor dead. If existence brought only suffering, and the pursuit of meaning led inevitably to corruption, if consciousness itself was nothing more than an elaborate form of torment inflicted upon beings too stubborn to embrace the peace of non-existence, then perhaps the time had come to reject the burden of awareness and seek whatever lay beyond the boundaries of thought and sensation. The fall from Icecrown's peak lasted only moments in time measured by mortal instruments, yet during that descent I experienced what felt like lifetimes of memory and reflection, as if the approach of true death had somehow accelerated my consciousness to encompass entire ages of experience within the space between heartbeats. I saw again the face of every person I had failed to protect, relived every moment of shame and compromise that had marked my journey from idealistic protector to pragmatic monster, felt the weight of every choice that had carried me further from the light I had once served toward shadows I had learned to call home. The impact that should have ended my existence instead opened doorways to realms of experience that mortal minds were never meant to explore, revealing landscapes of suffering so vast and intricate that they transformed physical pain into merely another form of inadequate metaphor. I found myself suspended in a void that possessed all the characteristics of classical descriptions of hell, while somehow managing to exceed those accounts in both scope and creative cruelty. This was not simply punishment for specific crimes, but a state of being designed to extract the maximum possible anguish from consciousness itself. The darkness that surrounded me was not merely absence of light, but presence of something actively hostile to every concept of comfort or hope, a substance that seemed to feed on despair while generating more despair in an endless cycle of regenerating misery. Within that darkness moved shapes that had once been people, creatures whose consciousness had been preserved through whatever process brought souls to this place, while their capacity for joy or peace had been surgically removed with precision that suggested both intelligence and malice in the architecture of their torment. Yet even in that realm of perfect suffering, I was not permitted the luxury of simple victimhood, for among the tormented I recognized faces that accused me of complicity in their presence here. The night elves of Teldrassil burned eternal in flames that consumed without destroying, their agony sustained by energies that violated every natural law while preserving their ability to experience pain in its purest form. They looked upon me, not with forgiveness or understanding, but with the terrible clarity that comes to those who have been betrayed by someone they trusted to protect them. Here walked the spirits of Forsaken, who had followed my leadership into battles they had not chosen for causes they had not understood, their loyalty rewarded with destruction that extended beyond mere physical death into realms where suffering became an art form practiced by masters whose skill exceeded any mortal conception of cruelty. They reached toward me with hands that could never quite make contact, speaking words I could not quite hear, yet their meaning was unmistakable. I had led them to this place through choices that had served my purposes rather than their welfare. The revelation that awaited me in those depths struck with force that made every previous understanding seem like childish simplification, showing me truths about the nature of existence that no living mind should ever be required to confront. Free will, that precious gift I had cherished above all others during my mortal life, revealed itself as elaborate illusion designed to make suffering more exquisite by convincing the sufferers that they had somehow chosen their own torment. Every decision I had believed myself to be making autonomously had been anticipated, planned for, incorporated into designs whose scope stretched across dimensions and eons. The architect of this revelation introduced himself with courtesy that would have been appropriate in any civilized court, speaking in tones that carried neither hatred nor contempt, but something far more terrible: the dispassionate interest of a researcher discussing the results of experiments conducted upon subjects whose welfare had never been a consideration. He explained that my entire existence, from birth through death through resurrection and beyond, had been choreographed according to patterns established before my world had condensed from cosmic dust and stellar gases. What I had interpreted as growth, as learning, as the gradual accumulation of wisdom through experience had been nothing more than the unfolding of predetermined sequences, the playing out of roles written by intelligences that understood the mathematics of suffering with precision that approached the divine. My love for my family, my dedication to protecting my people, my eventual transformation into something capable of orchestrating atrocities, all of these apparent changes in my character had been calculated with the same mechanical accuracy that governs the movements of celestial bodies through the void. Yet even as he spoke these words that should have shattered any remaining faith in the possibility of meaningful existence, The jailer offered something that resembled hope, wrapped in promises too vast for mortal comprehension to fully encompass. The system that had produced such suffering was not eternal or unchangeable, but merely the current iteration of designs that could be rewritten according to better principles, patterns that might serve purposes more benevolent than the extraction of anguish from conscious beings. He possessed the knowledge necessary to remake the fundamental structures that governed existence itself, to create realities where suffering was not the organizing principle around which all other experiences were arranged. This transformation would require agents capable of operating within the current system while working to undermine its foundations, beings who understood both its strengths and its weaknesses through intimate experience of its operations. I had been shaped by suffering into an instrument capable of inflicting suffering, educated in the arts of destruction, until I could recognize the weak points in any structure designed to preserve order and stability. These qualifications, earned through trials that had cost me everything I had once valued, now recommended me for service in a cause that promised to redeem even the most terrible sacrifices. The bargain he offered carried conditions that would have horrified the woman I had once been, demanding the surrender of every remaining fragment of humanity that might interfere with the ruthless efficiency required for cosmic renovation. Compassion, mercy, the capacity for doubt or regret, all of these qualities that had once defined my character would need to be systematically eliminated if I were to serve effectively in the campaign he was planning. I would become something beyond good and evil, as those concepts were understood by limited minds. An agent of transformation whose methods might appear monstrous to those incapable of perceiving the ultimate benefits they would produce. The choice was mine to make, he assured me, though choice itself was a concept he had already demonstrated to be largely illusory. I could accept his offer and become part of something greater than any individual existence, or I could remain in this realm of perfect torment until the heat death of the universe and beyond. The decision was free in the sense that no external force would compel my selection of either option. Yet the weight of context made acceptance seem inevitable as the movement of planets in their prescribed orbits. I chose service not from noble motives, but from the pragmatic recognition that collaboration offered possibilities while resistance guaranteed nothing but eternal suffering for myself and everyone whose existence had been touched by mine. If the fundamental structures of reality were as flawed as he claimed, if the system that had produced such magnificent quantities of anguish was indeed capable of being improved, then perhaps the methods required to achieve that improvement could be justified by the magnitude of the benefits they would ultimately deliver. The return to the world of apparent life brought with it responsibilities I had never sought and powers I had never desired, yet also opportunities to work toward goals that transcended the narrow concerns of individual survival and advancement. The Valkyr who had preserved me from the full consequences of my attempted suicide became both companions and tools in this larger purpose. Beings whose existence demonstrated that death itself could be transformed into a resource rather than an ending. Through them, I learned to see the boundary between life and death, not as an absolute barrier, but as a permeable membrane that could be manipulated by those who understood the proper techniques. The role of war chief, thrust upon me by circumstances I had not anticipated, carried authority over living beings who could never fully comprehend the forces they were caught up in. Individuals whose limited perspectives prevented them from recognizing the cosmic significance of choices they experienced as merely local or temporary. Leading them required a kind of theatrical performance, presenting motivations they could understand while pursuing objectives that exceeded the boundaries of their imagination. I became an actress playing the part of a conventional leader while serving purposes that belonged to entirely different categories of ambition. The burning of Teldrassil represented not merely tactical necessity, but a fundamental statement about the nature of existence and the willingness to embrace methods that served ultimate rather than immediate goods. Those who died in those flames would suffer for a time, perhaps even for eons as time was measured in the realm I had visited, but their sacrifice would contribute to transformations that might eventually eliminate suffering altogether from the catalogue of possible experiences. The mathematics were brutal but undeniable. Finite anguish accepted now could prevent infinite anguish later if one possessed the courage to perform calculations that weaker minds would find unbearable. Yet even as I justified these actions through appeals to cosmic purpose and ultimate benefit, some portion of my consciousness recognized that I had become indistinguishable from the enemies I had once opposed with such passionate conviction. Arthas had doubtless told himself similar stories about necessity and greater good, had probably found equally compelling reasons to believe that his methods served purposes more important than the immediate welfare of those who suffered under their application. The realization that I had become what I had once fought against carried implications too terrible to examine closely. Suggestions about the nature of evil that challenged every assumption I had ever made about moral distinctions. Perhaps this too was part of the design, another element in patterns whose complexity exceeded my ability to fully comprehend their implications. The corruption of heroes into villains, the transformation of protectors into predators, the eternal cycle by which those who opposed evil gradually became evil themselves. All of this might serve functions in the larger architecture of existence that justified even the most horrific individual tragedies. Or perhaps these were simply the rationalizations that consciousness created when faced with realities too terrible to accept without the mediation of explanatory narratives. The revelation of predestination that had been demonstrated to me in that realm of perfect suffering cast doubt upon every choice I believed myself to have made, every decision that had seemed to emerge from free deliberation and autonomous judgment. If my transformation from protector to destroyer had been anticipated by intelligences that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension, if even my rebellion against conventional morality served purposes established before my birth, then what meaning could be assigned to concepts like guilt or responsibility, or the possibility of redemption? These philosophical questions took on practical urgency as I found myself increasingly isolated from any source of comfort or companionship that might have mitigated the growing coldness at the core of my being. The living beings around me, even those who served my purposes most faithfully, remained fundamentally alien to my transformed consciousness, their concerns and motivations appearing simultaneously precious and pathetic when viewed from perspectives that encompassed cosmic rather than merely planetary considerations. I could manipulate their hopes and fears with increasing skill, could predict their responses to various stimuli with mechanical accuracy, yet I could no longer remember what it felt like to share their limitations. The loneliness that resulted from this isolation was not the simple sadness of being separated from loved ones, but something more fundamental. The recognition that I had evolved beyond the possibility of genuine connection with any form of consciousness that remained bound by conventional categories of thought and feeling. I existed in a space between different orders of being, too changed to find comfort among mortals, yet not sufficiently transformed to discover satisfaction in the cold mathematics that governed my new purposes. In quiet moments, when the demands of leadership and the requirements of the cosmic plan I served temporarily permitted reflection, I wondered whether the woman who had once stood on the walls of Silver Moon and believed in the possibility of protecting what mattered most had truly died on the day Arthas struck her down, or whether she had been dying by degrees through all the years that followed, murdered slowly by the choices that had seemed necessary for survival and advancement. Perhaps consciousness itself was the true enemy, the source of all suffering that might be eliminated if one possessed the courage to embrace the peace of absolute dissolution. Yet even these moments of doubt served purposes in designs whose scope exceeded my ability to fully comprehend, for uncertainty itself had been incorporated into the patterns that governed my existence, transformed from weakness into tool for achieving objectives that required precisely calibrated levels of internal conflict. I had become a weapon aimed at the heart of reality itself, an instrument of transformation whose effectiveness depended upon the preservation of just enough humanity to understand what was being destroyed and just enough inhumanity to complete the destruction without being paralyzed by empathy or regret. The final phase of my service would require the surrender of even these last vestiges of individual identity, the complete integration of my consciousness into purposes that transcended personal existence altogether. When that time came, I would cease to be Sylvanas Windrunner in any meaningful sense and become simply another component in machinery designed to remake the fundamental structures that governed all possible experience. Until then, I remained suspended between what I had been and what I was becoming, conscious of my condition yet powerless to alter the trajectory that carried me toward dissolution in service of transformations whose ultimate effects remained hidden behind veils of cosmic secrecy. Here in this realm of eternal shadow, where time moves like honey through broken glass, and space bends according to laws written by minds that understood suffering as both art and science, I continue the work that has become my penance and perhaps my salvation. Each soul I guide toward the light of proper judgment feels like a small victory against the vast machinery of injustice that once consumed me so completely, a single thread in a tapestry of redemption whose final pattern remains hidden behind veils of cosmic mystery. The Moor stretches endlessly in all directions, its geography shifting according to principles that mock conventional understanding of cause and effect. Yet I have learned to navigate its contradictions with something approaching grace. The lost souls that drift through these spaces carry within themselves echoes of the same questions that have haunted my own existence. Whether consciousness without hope can find meaning, whether choice remains possible when all options lead toward various forms of suffering, whether love can survive transformations that seem designed to destroy every capacity for tenderness. In searching for these wandering spirits, I search also for Nathanos, whose presence in this place seems as inevitable as sunrise, yet remains frustratingly elusive, despite my best efforts to track him through landscapes that shift like dreams within dreams. Love, I have discovered, is perhaps the only force that survives all transformations intact, the single constant that persists through death and resurrection and damnation itself. When I find him again, as I must eventually find him, we will face together whatever eternity holds for creatures such as ourselves, beings who have learned to make meaning from circumstances that should have destroyed any possibility of meaning. The hope for reunion extends beyond Nathanos to encompass family bonds that death severed but could not ultimately destroy, connections that transcend the boundaries between different states of existence. My parents rest somewhere in realms I cannot yet reach, while Lyrith's music echoes through dimensions whose harmonies speak to possibilities I dare not examine too closely, lest hope itself become another form of torture. Yet the possibility remains that consciousness, purified through sufficient suffering and service, might eventually discover forms of peace that exceed anything available to the merely living. We are what our choices make us, even when those choices exist only between different varieties of horror, even when the act of choosing serves purposes we cannot fully comprehend. This understanding has become both burden and blessing, weight that threatens to crush whatever remains of my humanity and foundation upon which new forms of identity might eventually be constructed. I chose to serve rather than resist, to help rather than harm, to seek redemption rather than embrace the comfortable numbness of despair. and in that choice, discovered something that might yet prove worthy of the name virtue. The vigil I maintain in this place represents another form of undeath, consciousness preserved through mechanisms I do not entirely understand, yet sustained by purposes that transcend individual survival or comfort. Perhaps this too is illusion, another elaborate form of self-deception designed to make unbearable circumstances seem meaningful, yet the alternative to believing in the possibility of redemption is surrender to a nihilism so complete that it would render all suffering meaningless. Better to cling to hope, however fragile, than to embrace the void that promises nothing but eternal repetition of old agonies. Until the last lost soul finds its proper destination, and I am all that remains of the torment that once filled this place, I will continue this work that has become my identity and my purpose, conscious of its irony yet committed to its completion. In the end, we are all stories we tell ourselves about the meaning of our existence, and I choose to believe that even the damned can write endings worthy of the pain that preceded them.